You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 234. Returning to the show today is the great Scott Horton. He is the editor of antiwar.com, the director of the Libertarian Institute, and the fantastic book on Afghanistan that I actually just finished up rereading this week, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Scott, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Kyle. How you doing, man? Thank you for having me.
Great. And I made sure to not wait 100 episodes to get you back on this time. And I think, we kind of have the 1 year anniversary of the Trump policy, when Trump implemented his policy for Afghanistan. So good time to get on and talk about what's going on there. There's been some developments that even caught the eye of the mainstream media with, some talks with the Taliban and, possibly a new commander coming in, of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. But I thought to start, we just kind of review the Trump policy for Afghanistan, which I guess really isn't much more than what Obama was doing. He just had a few thousand troops. But one of the things they started doing is trying to disrupt the Taliban drug trade. So, Scott, I guess I'll let you start there. How's that gone for the U.S. in Trump's year of this plan?
Well, it's funny, man. There's this piece at Moon of Alabama today, or from a couple of days ago, maybe, where Bernard talks about this, the drug war, and how they'd spent however many, was it $2 billion or something, trying to bomb these drug targets. And even from the beginning of when they kind of debuted this story, they were talking about, look, we're sending in B-52s and F-22s to do these strikes. And then they even showed, these ridiculous kind of just particle board type shacks out, in the backyard of some guy's property somewhere. And, like a local heroin refining lab on the smallest scale, if you even believe that's what these targets are at all. We're talking about the very smallest scale of opium refinement or packaging for distribution or whatever it is. And they're sending in B-52s to take them out, and F-22s, which, obviously just reveals kind of the nature of this entire thing, war as a racket for the military and for those who make money arming them. But and of course, this has achieved nothing. The entire Helmand province is basically opium territory, and much of the rest of the country as well. As I show in my book, people are always looking for the secret CIA conspiracy to, smuggle these drugs and that kind of thing. But the deal is that's kind of missing the forest for the trees kind of deal. The entire Afghan war on all sides, I won't say both because there's more than two, on all sides are financed by opium. Although, I would hasten to add that Andrew Cockburn, the great journalist from Harper's Magazine, did a report where he said, whenever you hear that the Taliban are making, X many hundreds of millions of dollars off of opium every year, that's really somewhat overblown. They're only able to tax a small amount of it, and they don't really run the farms themselves outright as their own, business, the insurgency. Although in some places the insurgency really isn't the Taliban. It's really just more like local warlords fighting over, the heroin, but, and who gets the right to tax it and be the local security force and get in on that. But, the way they put it is that all we have to do is knock out the Taliban's ability to deal drugs, and then that'll severely cripple their efforts against us. I mean, it sounds just like government work, right? Well, we all decided we agree on this and we're writing it down on a piece of paper. So now from now on, we believe that this is true. Let's just pretend hypothetically they could bomb all the heroin labs. Well, what difference is that going to make? In reality, if you use economic thought at all, or just, think about human nature at all from outside of the point of view of the Air Force guys coming up with these plans or the whatever counterinsurgency experts, well, you'll know that all the angry farmers being put out of work or heroin distributors being put out of work are just going to pick up a rifle and join the insurgency. They're going to have nothing else to do. They're going to have more motive than ever to resist the Americans and those who serve them. And so the whole thing obviously is counterproductive anyway. And then, of course, if you have a real libertarian insight about how drug markets work, then you see that, again, assuming they could make any progress in really targeting drug distribution infrastructure of the enemy or their tax collector, do assassination strikes against the Taliban's local IRS agents as they go around extorting these farmers or that kind of thing. All that's going to do is drive up the price and induce more people to figure out a way to get in on heroin, the next time around anyway. We see that over and over again. And same thing really for doing, decapitation strikes against the leaders of drug cartels, where then all their lieutenants just go to war over who gets to be the new Tony Soprano in charge of the thing. And everything gets much more violent and prices get higher and more competition is lured into the contest and everything else happens every time. It's why prohibition didn't work 100 years ago. And it's why, drug prohibition in America or Afghanistan or anywhere else doesn't work in 2018.
In 2017, they destroyed a record amount of opium, production in poppy plants, I guess. And they still had a record amount, produced after the record amount of destruction. So, I mean, it really shows that the United States, doesn't seem to really be able to have the ability to do anything to deter poppy growth and opium, coming out of Afghanistan. Another one of the, I guess, goals, somewhat that was floated throughout the year of the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan is to secure the city of Kabul, which has grown, several 100% since the U.S. started occupying Afghanistan in 2001. But we've seen some pretty big terrorist attacks there. So I guess just you being the expert on Afghanistan, what has happened in the past year in Kabul and how bad has, the terrorist activity been? Or the insurgency?
I really am not the expert. I haven't spent time in the country in that sense. I just watched the whole war all along from here and, had a solid take on it all along. And so I had a story to tell about it there, but, I don't want to claim that, Anand Gopal on the ground over there with the real experience. But, from what I can tell, trying to keep up with all Afghanistan news at antiwar.com and so forth, is, there have been a few major terrorist attacks. But I mean, that's just the nature. They said they were going to have a ring of steel to protect Kabul, but come on. I mean, what is that even supposed to mean? Especially in this war where the Taliban coming over the hill, they actually aren't attackers. They came with some money to buy some guns from the Afghan National Army that they're going to turn around and use against them in 2 weeks. This kind of thing, there's no, people are picturing Saving Private Ryan with opposing armies meeting out in a field somewhere or something like this. Is not really the nature of the Afghan war, this insurgency against all these different powers. And so, they provide the best security that they can. And I think the Taliban and the so-called Islamic State forces there, who are really, backed by, are Pakistanis, presumably backed by the Pakistani ISI there. They don't really have the ability to take any territory in Kabul. But, they do, I guess, like proving from time to time that they can't be kept out either. And so, they've done a couple of strikes. I don't think, either of the co-presidents have, I don't think there've been any close assassination attempts against them lately. Ghani and Abdullah there. But, General Dostum just came back. He's the vice president and former defense minister and a former CIA-backed warlord from the 80s. And he just came back from Turkey, where he was basically hiding out from the law because he had his men kidnap and rape a former provincial governor, not just a mayor, but a governor, with the barrel of an AK-47. And so instead of, facing charges against that, he fled to Turkey for a while. He just came back a couple of weeks ago, and there was a massive car bomb attack against him at the airport, which may have been done by the government, by Ghani, or I guess Ghani is Dostum's guy. Abdullah is the guy who hates him. So I don't know. But anyway, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is now the warlord is from Hizb Islami is now back in the capital city, causing trouble all the time as well. So, I don't know, who knows. Dostum survived that attack, but I think like 8 or 9 of his security guys were killed in it. So it was a pretty close call for him. And then, recently there was a big story about the Taliban accepting the surrender of Islamic State fighters up there in the north of Afghanistan, which really went to show how powerful the Taliban are even up in the north of the country, where, traditional Pashtunistan, as far as on the Afghan side of the line, is in the south and the east. And there are some Pashtun populations in the north where, at different times in the 20th century, there had been some relocations of people and this and that. But, it was a pretty big deal to see them, being able to fight and beat Islamic State fighters and accept their surrender. And I think then they handed the Islamic State fighters over to the Afghan National Army. And then they were quoted saying something like, "We will treat them as honored guests," maybe like in a Trumpian, a little too ham-handed way, trying to praise their enemies there. But then the Americans were like, "No, we will not. We'll treat them as prisoners of war," and all this and that, kind of hawking it up there. Although, I think possibly part of the framing there is, in Afghanistan, they had the Petraeus surge, but without the awakening. So the awakening was when they bribed in Iraq the Sunni-based insurgency, which is, basically nationalist and tribalist in nature, to turn against the foreigners, the Al-Qaeda and Iraq guys, later known as the Islamic State, who, many of them were from Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other places and were coming and kind of, trying to take over the Sunni insurgency and boss the locals around too much. And so really a year before Petraeus got there, the local Sunni tribes were already turning on Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So what Petraeus did was kind of co-opt that and say, okay, we'll go along with this effort and then we'll call the reduction in attacks and we'll bribe the Sunni insurgents to stop attacking us and focus on Al-Qaeda and promising them jobs in the future, this kind of thing. Well, so that worked at least temporarily for calling off the Sunni insurgency against the U.S. to give the U.S. enough time to leave the country. But in Afghanistan, it's just the Taliban are the enemy. So now, in a sense, they have this, I'm not saying they concocted the Islamic State in Afghanistan for this reason, but I think, the Pakistani government did concoct the Islamic State there, or had a lot to do with the rise of these so-called Islamic State fighters there. And so, but anyway, possibly this, can fit within the imagination of the American, generals there, that they could use this as a way to kind of save face and say, well, you know what? We decided that the Taliban aren't that bad. If they're going to kill the Islamic State for us, call that the awakening, pretend like it's really the Taliban coming our way when they're doing what they would do against the Islamic State anyway, who are their competition for power, right? But then kind of claim that, in the way that, okay, the Taliban aren't that bad as long as they're fighting these guys who are worse. Because there are no Al-Qaeda guys to fight. There haven't been since 2001 when they got away. And so there hasn't really been anyone to split the Taliban from. They are the insurgency. They're the radical edge of it, but they're the moderate the side of it too,
Right. Well, I guess how is the American fight against ISIS-K going? Because, Trump kept saying that's who we are bombing, and the Americans talked about, that's who we are bombing. But if you look back over the past year at the headlines, a lot of these suicide attacks and different attacks, either kidnapping like Western aid workers or attacking the voter registration sites, were carried out by ISIS-K. I think even a couple times they attacked sites and the Taliban came out and like kind of condemned the attack. I think one was that like a cricket match, and maybe the Taliban don't attack sports games for whatever reason. And they've attacked, I think a Taliban commander or something like that was killed in an ISIS explosion. So, but what has the American, any success been against ISIS-K?
Well, no, I mean, of course, Stanley McChrystal's insurgent math kicks in here. For everybody you kill, you create 10 more insurgents. And so, we saw this play out and I think this is a great example because, it caught the news. Everybody kind of would remember what we're talking about on this. And it's sort of the best kind of counterfactual that you could use or example that you could use to show. So they dropped not just some bombs, but they dropped the Moab, the mother of all bombs, the massive air, ordnance, whatever penetrator thing. And so what happened was they killed all these people. and they generated all these headlines. People took it as a threat against North Korea at the time, but it didn't look like that to me. It looked like it was just the special operations commander on the ground. So let's drop a Moab. And the news story there really was that authority to do so had devolved so low down the chain of command that probably no one in DC was even consulted on that. And they went ahead and did it. But then, and I quote this in the book from the New York Times, one of the experts from AfghanAnalyst.org wrote a thing about how the Islamic State radio station in Nangarhar province was blaring and gloating that this has done so much for recruitment, and it was driving up, people driving people into their cause, because it made them look important. And that was kind of in question. They were like maybe kind of in the opinions of the locals, some wannabe gangsters, and maybe weren't to be taken so serious. But if that's true, how come the Americans dropped the biggest bomb they got other than a nuke on us? That is a measure of how important we are, because we are the vanguard of God's forces on earth and against the evil American devils and whatever. It fit their propaganda perfectly. And of course, it's not that these young fighters want to join up so they can get bombed by the mother of all bombs. It's that they want to join up to fight those who would dare to use such a, massive and horrible bomb against their people. And of course, there was a bunch of civilians killed. I mean, whatever they claimed, there may have been some fighters there. But again, these fighters are civilians too, really. They're local militia guys picking up weapons to fight against their, invaders, in this case, the Green Berets. And so I think there have been only 3, you say only, their lives sure mattered to their people. But I think 3 Americans, maybe 4, have been killed fighting in Nangarhar in the last year, since Trump announced the escalation. And, so it's over 2,400 now, 2,413 or something, I think it is now. If the problem's going to be solved, the problem of ISIS-K, as it's called, the Khorasan province there, if that problem is going to be solved, probably the best case would be to let the Taliban handle it, because they're the ones who could actually hold down the territory and prevent them from coming back and maintain a monopoly on authority there. And, if Bill Clinton could support the Taliban, and not just in order, to come to a peace with their enemies and compromise, but in order to help them take the entire country in the 1990s, which they were almost done with that project. They had just a little bit left to go in 2001. If Bill Clinton can get along with the Taliban that well, it seems like America could accept the fact that they've won this war. Years ago, they won this war. Before Obama launched the surge, they had won this war. Nothing has changed in all this time. Trump has unleashed, first of all, he sent another, 4,000 or 5,000 guys, and they kind of rotate in and out, so it fluctuates. But he sent about 5,000 more guys. And what he's really done is he sent 50,000 more bombs. They had loosened the rules of engagement on airstrikes to a degree, to the point where have seen numbers of airstrikes in Afghanistan in the last year that are, that surpass even or right around the number of bombs that were dropped in 2011 at the height of the Obama surge, when you had 100,000 men in the country calling these targets and this and that. And they're just bombing the hell out of the place, and they're killing, civilians. And I had a story here. Where Jason Ditz at news. No, this is a different one. Sorry. First of all, the Taliban are having great successes across the country, attacking in Uruzgan province and all that. But in terms of the airstrikes, I guess I lost this tab, but there was an airstrike where the Americans bombed Afghan National Army forces, I think last night. Maybe it is on antiwar.com right now. Anyway, there was one where it was the Americans. It was a friendly fire attack. Unless I got that wrong, I'm pretty sure there's a different story about the Taliban killing about 40 guys in Ghazni province. I admit I can't find my tab right now, but I'm fairly certain I saw one about a friendly fire strike. Anyway, the United Nations, I know that Moon of Alabama in his Afghan article today has a quote from the United Nations about civilian casualties being the highest that they've been this whole time. And that's, to be expected. And we don't have nearly as much media in Afghanistan as we used to have, and a much smaller willingness to report on it, I guess, on the part of the major media outlets in America. So we just don't hear about all this happening until it's like end of the year summaries. Like, wow, look how many bombs we dropped. And again, just because you call a man a militant, it's not like these guys really necessarily are anything more than just the neighborhood guys who grabbed their rifle and basically felt they had no choice but to try to fight. But in a way, it's kind of cheating to say that, once they pick up their AK-47, they don't have a right to live anymore. Now it's not murder to kill them in the way it would be to kill, or even regretful collateral damage the way it would be to kill their wife or their kid that they leave back at the house, when really they're civilians too, Doesn't that seem kind of unfair if someone was waging a drone war over our country, that your life and my life are forfeit because we're fighting age males, but really we're just civilians too. We didn't join up the army to go and fight and, where all's fair in love and war and all that kind of thing. These are people in their neighborhoods that we're fighting against here. And again, that American forces have lost too, because there's no way to win this war short of, in terms of real victory. And what are you going to do about it now other than breaking out the H-bombs or the smallpox blankets and just, committing genocide and killing all these people, which, I don't think anybody is really for that or ever was for doing that. They just won't admit to themselves that that's the only thing that would, quote unquote, work, is the peace of desolation. But as long as the Pashtun people are there, I think they've proven they're not going to submit to America's will. They'd rather die trying, succeeding, to keep us from doing so. It's the same thing as if someone tried to conquer the United States. We'd all yell Wolverines and go and shoot them, man. Come on. This whole thing is stupid.
Right. Well, I was going to say, this is the Taliban game to live out their Red Dawn scenario.
And we're the Reds this time.
I want to move on to something that seems a little bit more positive, and there have been some direct talks now between a U.S. official and some Taliban officials, I think, in Qatar. So, Scott, do you have any optimism? I think when we talked on Foreign Policy Focus, episode 100, you kind of said, well, it doesn't look good, but there is Donald Trump. So are we going to maybe get that, what everybody was hoping for with Donald Trump, which was that, he was just going to be so out of line from the foreign policy establishment. And when it didn't work, he was just going to throw his hands up and say, I'm done with it. We're coming home.
Yeah. I really don't know, man. Obviously he told Rand Paul that we're ending this thing. Rand Paul said, trust me, it's going to end. And I do. And I said this on the Ron Paul show a few months ago. When I was on there with Dan McAdams and Ron Paul on the Liberty Report, that I do know a guy who knows some guys in the White House and who told him, in something that I think is a bit too optimistic in terms of timeline, but that Trump really wanted to pull everybody out of Afghanistan and Syria this summer, that he was just sick and tired of this, that Bolton was going to go and, some other change was going to happen in the administration. And you know what? The Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, and the Syrian army, all they have left is Idlib province to take back from the CIA's terrorists there. And the CIA effort for them has been called off a year ago now. And so the Americans don't really have anything to do in eastern Syria other than pull out. There's nothing to do there other secure some oil resources for an American company or two or something. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think anybody really wants that to be or considers that a reason enough to stay. The only reason to stay there is in the name of Iran, but that's kind of ridiculous. Iran doesn't have that much of an interest in expanding their power in a way that's going to wear out their welcome in Syria. They have a great little relationship with Assad there, especially in victory against the Sunni insurgency that they've defeated together there. So I don't think that, obviously in the war party hype, the Iranians are going to want to build up all their forces there as a forward base to attack Israel or something, but that's stupid. I just don't believe in that kind of crap. You got to already have your big dumb begged question that the evil Iranians will stop at nothing to hurt poor little Israel, but that's a bunch of garbage. So without that, presumed fake premise there, I don't think any of those, excuses even amount to an excuse to stay. Certainly not a real reason. And then Afghanistan, as I hope is somewhat famous now, Donald Trump opposed the surge in Afghanistan. He has said, get out of Afghanistan all this time. And even one time took Obama's side. Obama, who he hated so much, he took Obama's side against the generals when it was time for the end of the surge. And the generals, started leaking. They were going to try to roll Obama again and push for him to keep the troops there and not surge them back out again. And Donald Trump took Obama's side. Said the generals are wrong. They should do what the commander in chief says, this and that. So he knows better. He's the kind of guy. It's not that he knows everything about Afghanistan, but he just knows that this is stupid. What are we doing? We're in North America. We're trying to dominate Central Asia forever. This is dumb. Why would we want to? It's not worth it. Let the Russians or the Chinese worry about their own backyard and get us the hell out of there, man. And so, he doesn't seem to buy the premise. On the other hand, he doesn't mind just keeping the war going. Apparently, he did order the escalation. He could have fired McMaster and said, hell no, last year. And instead, he ordered this escalation. Massive escalation of bombing and this escalation of troops there. And so I don't know. But then, there's a story by Spencer Ackerman in the Daily Beast where he talks about this U.S. Army, I think, colonel who, had spent enough time in Afghanistan and really kind of made himself a go-between working with the State Department to try to break the ice on getting some talks going with the Taliban. And they seem to not necessarily have dropped this demand, because I certainly haven't seen them contradict it, but they haven't really been raising publicly their demand that all American forces must leave before they'll talk to us, that there's nothing to talk about as long as U.S. troops are in the country, which has been their perspective all along. And I guess they had kind of fine-tuned that to say that, any three-party talks that would include the Afghan government, we'd have to leave first, and then they'll deal with the Afghan government. And not necessarily us, or they'll deal with us as long as we're not even there anymore. But in this case, they're sort of switching and apparently opening themselves up to, well, we didn't say anything about unilateral talks or bilateral talks with the Americans here, without the Afghan government. So they're leaving the Afghan government out, and they had apparently a meeting or whatever in Qatar, and, talks toward the holding of talks to see if they're going to have something to negotiate. And I'm not very hopeful for that. If the Americans let them know that, look, man, you got to give Donald Trump the opportunity to get out of here. He's trying to take it. Don't be a pain in the ass, and get them to, let him save face in a way for the American soldiers and call it a victory and this kind of thing on the way out the door. Then, maybe they will go along with that if they can convince him. But, I don't know I don't know how well the American state is going to represent that point of view, or how serious Trump is about trying to end it now. In my book, I say, just forget it. Just go. Let them work it out. Let the Taliban have their way, where they and the Afghan government have their own negotiations without us after American forces leave. Because what do we even need to be there for? We really don't. And so just go ahead and go, because if the solution is we have to come to a negotiated agreement with them, they've really shown that they won't fight. A lot of great journalists and reporters and authors from all over the place have really shown how there's not much of a unified Taliban command to deal with. There are a lot of different insurgent groups that kind of fight under that name. It's not altogether clear that whoever they're meeting with in Doha, Qatar, have the authority to speak for really anybody else. One major story here, and apparently this is really true, as crazy as it sounds, is the furthest they ever got negotiating was in 2010 with a guy who claimed to be Mullah Mansour, who was Mullah Omar's successor as a leader of the Taliban. And the guy was just an imposter. And he was just showing up and leaving with, pockets stuffed with $100 bills, and was shining these guys on for almost a year. And he had no tie to Mansour and no tie even to the Taliban. He was just some guy in there. And the State Department guys bought this and, completely wasted all that time thinking that they were negotiating with the leader of the damn Taliban. And got completely played for suckers by some random dude. So, that ought to show you right there, right, that any American negotiations are going to be a government program too, just like the whole rest of the war. And, I guess I would just emphasize that I don't think the American people would mind at all I think the American people don't care if you call it a victory or not. And obviously Donald Trump is going to lay on as thick as he possibly can any praise for the soldiers as he pulls them out of there, if he ever does. You know, you've sacrificed everything and served us so proudly and won a great victory, and everyone knows you're the greatest warriors that ever warriored, and whatever he has to say while he's pulling them out in defeat, you know, fine. That should be fine. I mean, look, it's 2018. Anybody from any walk of life who knows anything at all about American foreign policy, enough to even know that there is a war in Afghanistan, can look at it and say, hey, you know what? 17 years, I think, is pretty good for a war. Let's go ahead and wrap this up now. Wars are in American tradition, supposedly, wars are supposed to be, you know, temporary disruptions to the standard of how we're supposed to live, you know, in peace and commerce and liberty and all that kind of stuff. So, I think just regular people. If Donald Trump is just a Fox News watching golfing millionaire blowhard in his 70s kind of a caricature, which he is, and even he can think that, then that means, you know, basically he could convince the rest of the Fox News audience to agree. And really, what do we have to lose except a little bit of face? And it's Donald Trump, so he can just act like he doesn't care, and then it won't matter at all, you know?
Yeah, and I'm sure it would turn out to be an excellent political move. I mean, the Rachel Maddows of the world with their Trump, you know, derangement syndrome will probably start immediately opposing this piece, saying that somehow it's going to benefit Russia. And then, anytime something goes wrong, they'll, you know, go point back to Barack Obama calling it the good war or something crazy like that. And, you know, just oppose it because they're so afraid of Donald Trump. And this has to be something that the American people like. I just can't imagine that, like, everybody's been exposed to this war. It's been going on so long. You know, who doesn't know somebody that, you know, was either deployed there or, you know, whose brother died there or you know, something like that. Right. That it just has to, I imagine it has to be a good political move on the ground, you know, for the average American person.
Yeah, exactly. And what a great way, you know, politically speaking, it'd be so much easier for Trump to do it than Obama. Because if all he has is a bunch of liberals shrieking about Russia, and think of how easy the frame is that, like, hey, look, everybody, the party, Nancy Pelosi and Charles Schumer say we should keep the war in Afghanistan going, but I don't. So how are you going to vote now or whatever? You know, put it like that. You're going to go die for Nancy Pelosi when the president himself doesn't want to do it anymore? The argument's done and won right there. You know what I mean? These sloppy liberals, they don't have to put their lives on the line. Why should we go fight wars for them? It just attacked the whole project from the right. And that's the way to win it. And of course, that's what this whole fake Russiagate thing is about, is trying to hem him in on this so that anything he does can be framed as treason. And, you know, it's not like he ever meant to abolish NATO anyway. He never really meant to abolish the empire. He just wants to wind down the worst of these things. But, you know, he gave a speech during the campaign at the Council for the National, or not the Council, just the National Interest Foundation. That's different. Zalmay Khalilzad introduced him. And the first thing he says, he goes, you know, the American empire is just way overextended. We just can't afford to dominate the entire planet Earth like this. And that's why in the Trump administration, we're going to have a really strong economy so that we can afford it. And so we can take over even more of the world. And just, you know, that's the way he thinks, man. He ain't no Rand Paul, much less Ron, you know?
Well, it just does go to show what a coward Obama was, that even Donald Trump had his back on this thing. And, you know, right. He also had Daniel Davis and Matthew Ho out there, you know, Army guys whistleblowing, you know, saying what a bad idea it was, and he couldn't stand up to it. But again, you know, Donald Trump just seems like the kind of guy that could finally be the one to end this kind of thing.
So. I think he just doesn't care enough. I think he figures that, you know, as long as he is saying to the military, you guys do whatever you think is necessary here, then his flank is covered. It's their fault, not his, that none of this stuff ever works out. And he's got to be able to realize how it never works out. You know, and speaking of Rand Paul, I don't know if you saw this thing in Politico magazine about how he and Trump are really getting along more now because he backed Trump up on Korea and on Russia when everyone else was attacking him so bad. And I guess, you know, Trump sent him to Moscow with a letter for Putin, which, wow, I wonder what it said, you know? But So they say in that article, and it's based on, I guess, a single source of White House aide, but the way they describe it, I can at least picture it. And that is that Trump and Rand Paul have been having a lot of fun cracking jokes at the hawk's expense. And now the way they put it in the article isn't even right, that Mattis and all of these guys have said that they want regime change. I mean, Mattis has said, no, that is not the policy. He's, clearly counts as a relative dove on Iran inside the administration. So I doubt that they would have been including him, but whatever. Apparently they're mocking John Bolton together and making fun of him and that kind of thing. And I guess, again, with my caricaturization of Donald Trump is I think he is just a know-nothing Fox News watching millionaire old golfer who, could be pretty easy to convince of a lot of bad, dumb stuff about Iran. But then also, when Rand Paul comes to him and goes, hey, look, let's get real. If you did what Bolton wanted, it'd destroy your presidency, man. It would be a disaster of a war. And yeah, we could whoop Iran. Don't get me wrong, but can they make life difficult for the rest of our interests throughout the Middle East and for years into the future? Yeah. Like this is the dumb thing to do, man. This is what Bolton would have told a Bush to do. You don't want to go like that. You don't want to do that and make it and, talk to him in that way and make it personal like that too. That, this is about you and what's good for you. Leave the Ayatollah. Nobody cares if the Ayatollah's there. I guess the Israelis do, and they're, the foundation for defense of democracies. But the rest of the Americans are used to having Ayatollahs in Iran. They've been there since 80, whatever. That's not a popular, campaign position that I started a George Bush style war, only this time against a country 3 times bigger than the last time over there. They're not going to go for that. And so apparently Rand has said that to Trump, and Trump went, hey, yeah, that sounds right. I don't know. They almost talked me into it, but I think you talked me out of it. That's the way they phrase it in that article, the way that they frame it, I guess, not phrase it, but, that Rand has really kind of said, John Bolton's wrong about stuff a lot or whatever. And they have a quote from Trump saying that he said to Bolton, look, McMaster was a hawk. I know you're a hawk, but I can handle you. I'm not worried about that or whatever. So in other words, maybe that he really sees these guys as protecting his right flank. But then, so where's the withdrawal? As I sit here saying all this, the escalation in Afghanistan is still on. The escalation in Syria is still on. They haven't repealed any of that. The war in Yemen, which is for and against Al Qaeda there at the same time, but mostly for, is still, huge. He sent infantry into Somalia. And, the Washington Post article on that says that he said to James Mattis, why do we have to send troops into Somalia? Who cares about Somalia, And that Mattis said, you have no choice. They have no choice. And then he gave into that and sent not just special operations forces, but infantry onto the ground there. Like, they're just going to defeat al-Shabaab once and for all, rather than making them more and more and more powerful as America has done since 2006, So I don't know, man. In other words, here he's in the perfect position where, despite all the Russia accusations and whatever, he's in a position of being right-wing national enough and already nationalist enough and already bloody-handed enough in these wars to say, look, we gave killing people the old college try now. Bush and Obama couldn't make it work. It's time to cut our losses. And, he's that character enough that I think that he could go ahead and get away with it. But I'm not really predicting it. And I gotta say too, cause people go, oh, well, he's just a figurehead, or, oh, he's just a puppet of the Israelis, or he's just to this, or he's just to that. I mean, the fact of the matter is the American presidency itself, the single man in that chair, has more power than anyone in the history of the whole world. And even though he may have the whole government against him, he can still make them do whatever he wants, and he can fire them until he finds a guy he likes. You're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. Now you, Mr. 3-star general, you want a 4-star? You're the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is what we're doing. And at some point, I saw someone make the analogy to FDR, where the Army and Marine generals and whoever, I don't know if the Marines were separate by then. Anyway, the Army generals, they didn't want to go back to Europe. And FDR was like, I do. You're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, until he found some guys who wanted to do it. And you guys want to be promoted? We're going back to Europe. Yes, sir. And so that's the deal. No one can stop him from doing that.
Right. I mean, one morning we could wake up with a tweet that says, all American troops will leave Afghanistan by the end of 2018. Like that could be the tweet tomorrow morning. And, Donald Trump gave the order and all the American people heard it. So now that everybody has to follow in line or he'll fire them till they do.
Yeah. And the deal is, people go, okay, well, but then, they'll shoot him like JFK or whatever. Well, you know what? He's rich. Let him hire his own security. Well, he doesn't have to, you know what? And I bet the Secret Service wouldn't kill him. Maybe someone else could get the Secret Service out of the way. But if he ever said, I don't know. I heard this story. Well, I don't know. I guess I shouldn't tell it because I'm not sure. I'd have to look this up. Well, I'll tell you the story. You can look it up yourself. I want to go and see now if I still believe this. I don't remember where I learned it, but that when Reagan got shot, that he ordered some Navy men or some Marines from a ship that was just docking in New Jersey to come and provide guard in the hospital there. Because he didn't know who had just shot him. He was like, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I'm going to take these sailors fresh off of this ship that's just pulling up to shore, and I'm going to put them in between me and whoever else to see what. So, in that position, I'm not saying it's without risk, but at the same time, I don't know. If you were the president, wouldn't you risk everything to abolish the wars, to end these horrible wars? I would. Go ahead and shoot me, man. That's all he's asking 19-year-old guys to do every day is get shot. So what the hell? You know what I mean?
Right. And Donald Trump just seems like the kind of person that could, hire whoever he needs to defend himself. I just feel like that's something that Donald Trump probably has some experience with in his life.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He's not going to ride in a convertible top and down Dealey Plaza and make that sharp left turn. Right? He ain't going to make that mistake.
Right. So, one change we have in Afghanistan with the, U.S., mission there is the change of commander, and they're putting in Scott Miller, who's I believe Special Forces commander. So, right. I mean, does this make any difference?
Yeah. I mean, it just goes to show more of the same. I mean, you could, first of all, if he's a special operations night raid guy, then more or less, you can bet that that's how he views the world as, high value targets. That's what you want to do because that's his job. And so that's the way he looks at it. But, they've already tried everything and everything else in Afghanistan and none of it's worked. There's no set of tactics or strategy that work for defeating this insurgency. And so, they've done, their counterinsurgency. They've done, all the different training and partnering up with local ground forces. They've done focuses on night raids and high value targets and drone strikes. They've done, wars against the drug industry. They've gone after, whatever the hell. I think, Andrew Basevich on my show one time went through all the different catchphrases for the different strategies on the ground there. And they just already have tried them all. And so, you send in, this is one of the ironies of the Obama surge was Petraeus at that time was the head of Central Command. And so it was McChrystal who was the Delta Force commander, Mr. Night Raid. And he was the one who was given command over Afghanistan and tried to implement this broad-based counterinsurgency strategy. Well, by the time he got fired for all of his men bad-mouthing Joe Biden and I guess him allowing this story as reported by Michael Hastings there got McChrystal fired. When Petraeus came in, he was the guy he was not a special operations guy. He was more Army infantry and had been in charge of training this and auxiliary that in Iraq War II and really had made he armed up the Sunni insurgency in Fallujah at first. And he went and armed up the Shiite militias to fight against them. And then he was in charge of training up the army, which really just became those militias even more. And then he was in charge of the giant failed surge where the reintegration of Iraq, did not take place. But supposedly he was the expert on counterinsurgency, even after losing Iraq War II. So then he goes over to when McChrystal is fired, Obama demotes Petraeus from the head of Central Command and makes him the general in charge of Afghanistan. And he abandons COIN immediately and goes back to night raids and special operations, what have you. So I'm sorry, all that just to say, their options are very limited. There's nothing that, no matter how, brilliant at tactics and strategy this new general is, it's not going to make any difference. I mean, Nicholson, the guy that he's replacing, has been in Afghanistan for years and years and years. You go back and find stories about, even before the surge, before the Obama surge, he was there, trying to hold things together in Helmand province and all this, and knows probably more about who's who and why it matters on the ground compared to any other general of his, rank or standing who could take that position. Nicholson is the most educated you got. And yet what's he been able to do about any of this? Nothing, So, if anything, having a new guy is going to make matters worse. If he tries to do big, stupid stuff to, prove himself or this kind of thing, I don't know. But I certainly wouldn't expect any gains unless from a level above him, Washington, D.C. is demanding that, like you put it, a very short timeline here. You're not going to get to kick the can down the road anymore. We're going to be every last soldier out by next June or whatever it is, something like that. Then he would have to move and get things done. But otherwise, and this is kind of why I was happy to end my book right at the part where Trump is ordering the surge, because I figured basically there'll be little ebbs and flows, but more or less the status quo is going to hold for the next, foreseeable few years. They're not going to do that big of a surge, but they're not going to get out either. And the Taliban are going to rule, half the country in the daytime and 60 or 80% at night. But then they're never going to take the provincial capitals and try to keep them. They attacked Ghazni the other day, but they're not going to, and they do that from time to time, but they're not going to try to seize Lashkar Gah in Helmand province or Kandahar city or, any of these cities on a permanent basis, because that'll get them attacked and blown up. They're still, a guerrilla force, at least compared to American forces there. So in other words, I don't think much is going to change. Now, you'd have to have a real big breakthrough with these talks, or you would have to have Trump take my position, which is, screw talks. Let's just go and forget that Afghanistan ever happened, which most people would be happy to oblige him. So, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's easier for him politically to just keep going. At least he figures. He could have ended the thing a year ago with the politics not much different. But I don't know, man. I wonder if Rand Paul's going to get one of these jobs. I mean, I know he's not going to make him the Secretary of Defense. I don't know. I guess he's probably not the right guy to be National Security Advisor. So I don't know if maybe he'll just be a senator and try to stay Trump's friend and give him some advice. But there's not too many guys to choose from who are good on these things and, could have that spot in the government,
Right, because like the other people they're talking about
go to Cato and start hiring Bandow and Carpenter, then at that point I think we can start celebrating, but not until then.
Right, because a lot of the talk you hear is that like next up would be Tom Cotton or some horrific situation like that.
Can you imagine? I mean, if people aren't familiar, Tom Cotton, he was an infantry officer in Iraq War II. So certainly to hear him tell it, he has all this weight and deference that he's owed on these issues, but he's a total nut. And there's a reason that he is supported by Bill Kristol to the tune of millions of dollars and all of his guys. He's one of these guys who blames everything that happened wrong in Iraq on Iran. But it wasn't Iran that took Baghdad and got rid of Saddam for Iran. It was Tom Cotton and his buddies who did that. And it's true. I'm happy to say, because it's just the fact that Iran's role in Iraq War II was utterly pernicious, man. It was horrible. They took full advantage of America's mistake. And I use that kind of, obviously more than half sarcastically. It was a very deliberate, premeditated murder plot to start this aggressive war. I'm not saying that it was some accident, but I'm saying the way that the war turned out was not what the Americans thought. It was not what they wanted to happen. And they ended up empowering, Iran's favorite guys. In fact, Abadi, there's a story at Elijah Magnier's website today about how Abadi, the third Dawa Party guy to be the president of Iraq or the prime minister of Iraq, he has really lost out now to the Iraqi nationalists. It's funny, but not for being too pro-Iran, for being too pro-America and supporting American sanctions against Iran. And so he knew he was out anyway. And so on the way out, he took this pot shot at Iran. I guess there is, as Magnier's reported, there's a lot of resentment against Iranian influence in Iraq, but it's certainly 1,000% more than it ever was under Saddam Hussein. And it was the Americans who made it this way by turning the Badr Brigade into the Iraqi army in the first place in Iraq War II. So it was Petraeus who did it too, by the way.
All right. Do you have time for one more question on Afghanistan?
Yeah.
So another big factor, I guess, is the election of Imran Khan in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, he has some more Pakistani nationalist kind of tendencies. Most of what I know from him is your episode with Eric Margolis, and I'll link to that in the show notes page for anybody who wants to go listen to that. But do you have any idea on it? One of the things I was thinking, he seems to want to really complicate the situation for the Americans. So maybe that could be something else where Trump just decides to bow out because Pakistan is no longer playing along.
Yeah. Well, I know the New York Times wasted no time whatsoever in attacking him and pretending like he was all on the side of the terrorists. What's funny though is, if you go back and look at what he said, and I'm not the world's expert on the guy or whatever, but basically all he said is exactly what you and I would have said. I'm like, what are they doing, man? They're bombing these people out in the Swat Valley and in those, northern occupied territories in the name of, they say, a handful of Arabs, of bin Laden's former allies hiding out with them there. And, with all this collateral damage, all these people killed and all of this crisis and all this then further radicalization in the country. And for what? Doesn't make sense. And meanwhile, hey, you just killed somebody's grandmother out in her garden. And, what the hell are you doing? How is our country continuing to go along with this policy? Yeah. He doesn't sound like some radical terrorist to me. He sounds like a guy who's just not owned lock, stock, and barrel by the U.S. So, I don't know why they would be in such and it depends who's they, but why they react so badly to stuff like this when, it seems like they could at least look at it more from the point of view of, okay, you know what? The Pakistani people have spoken. It's democracy. It's great. This is the guy that they wanted. And, what's our problem with him again? He wants to end the war in Afghanistan? Huh. You know what? Maybe, just maybe that's what the American people want too. Maybe we can turn this guy into a partner because we're changing our policies that he resents anyway. And then, I don't know. Otherwise, what do the Americans have to lose? It's not like, the real national security policy of the country isn't controlled by the ISI and the military anyway. I mean, there may be a push and a pull on policy with this new president. I forget if he's a president or a prime minister. I think he's a prime minister, right? I don't, it's not like he's going to be able to change everything overnight anyway. So I guess that was my initial impression, was what an overreaction on the part of the Americans who, they sure didn't care when Musharraf did a coup in 1998. I remember Madeleine Albright was like, oh, usually coups are things that we disapprove of sometimes or something. They didn't want to say anything bad at all about it. They didn't care. And, when all these, corrupt thieves and, these horrible kleptocrats have ruled Pakistan, they never complained about that. They prefer it that way, but they're worried that this guy might actually have a set of principles that's going to keep him from being other than their most loyal servant going forward. It seems like they might see how apparent and ugly all that is. But I guess it depends on who's looking. But I do remember seeing, on Twitter right away, some of the reaction to that New York Times headline was like, Islamic leader takes over country or something. And it's like, yeah, they're all Muslims, man. What are we talking about? How are you going to frame it that way when the way that they put it was 3 more words than if they just put his name, even if they'd put Imran Khan, former cricket star or whatever, that would have fit better than, ooh, terrible, scary brown person with nuclear weapons seizes power in election or whatever it was, however it was that they put it, with all this negativity in it. So, I don't know, man. I really should look more at what the Washington Post and the New York Times have written about him since then to see how they're, developing the American national security state's point of view on that.
Well, at least from what I've read, Guardian and BBC portrayed it as him being a playboy turned Islamist kind of fundamentalist. And, once he was having sex with 3 girls in a hotel room at the same time. And now he's, kind of the traditional Islamist rule and, oppression of women and how terrible this kind of thing is what I've read. Much less about, the Afghanistan thing, and really nothing talking about the fact that Pakistan has a bunch of nuclear weapons, and that would be their main concern. You would think would be, what's this guy going to do with the Pakistani nuclear weapons? Not what's he going to do in relation to the, American war next door. Right.
Yeah. And, I guess their idea is, if he gets too far off the reservation, he might give nukes to who? Our allies, the Saudis? I mean, which I don't think that the Pakistanis, they haven't, the Saudis help finance their nuclear weapons, but they haven't saw fit to give the Saudis any nukes yet, and then in that case, I'm not saying I'm for that, but I'm just saying if that's the big threat that they're going to proliferate, well, they're allies with all our allies. And if the threat is, possible war with India, I guess keep them divided and conquered or whatever supposedly serves American imperial interests there. But it seems to me like this guy, Khan, if you look at it from, say, just humanity's perspective or the American people's, what our idea of the national interest might be, which would emphasize peace over there and a resolution to a nuclear weapons standoff there, seems like this guy is actually the best bet going. He said, a lot of conciliatory things about the Indians and said, wherever they will take 1 step forward, we'll take 2 steps forward. We really want to resolve this issue. Now, I don't know just how solvable and resolvable the Kashmir issue is. I mean, you have people who basically, apparently in their majority wish to be independent but the Pakistanis want rule over their territory and the Indians already have it. And neither of those 2 sides seems to want to recognize real independence for Kashmir. So, maybe they would have some form of autonomy, this, that, the other thing, but it can't be where both India and Pakistan rule the land there. So, and who knows? I don't know what all, is to be worked out over that. I mean, it could be that the status quo is actually the best solution for the time being, except that you have such a threat. If it is the status quo in terms of who rules Kashmir, if that's the best thing for stability at this point, it seems somebody is going to have to negotiate a way for the Pakistanis to feel less bad about that if they have to give that up. I mean, the current, I didn't mean to say the status quo of this brinksmanship is, seems like, it's one of the greatest emergencies on earth, really. I'm just saying, I don't know how to resolve it, but I guess step 1 would be having a guy like Imran Khan saying, man, I don't want to fight about this. This is crazy. Let's be friends. Let's work this out. You make a deal. I'll make a deal. You call your guys. I'll call my guys, and we'll do kind of something to ratchet tensions down. I think that's great. And I think if the American, and it's just another one of these examples, which you see every day, basically, of the divergence between the interests of our government and the interests of the American people. And the American people, if you just told some guy you met at a diner somewhere, India and Pakistan are at this nuclear standoff over this territory, you'd think continuing a nuclear standoff or having some peace talks is preferable. They're all going to agree. Like, hey, why would we want to stand in the way of, or why would we resent and regret if the Pakistanis and the Indians are moving toward peace? That's just on the face of it. It's too far away. Not that it's too far away to be our concern if innocent lives are being lost or something like that, but it's too far away to affect our national interest in any way. It doesn't matter to America who owns Kashmir. The only threat to our interest there is if there's a nuclear war and all of our crops die. That's the deal. We got to keep those guys from shooting nukes at each other. Just as we got to keep, these states have to keep from the U.S. has to keep from nuking the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else. Here's another one that needs to be resolved. And of course, the obvious solution to all this would be unilateral nuclear disarmament by the United States. That's it. We're just not doing nukes anymore. And now that we're not, we insist that everybody else follow our lead. And that'd be worth a hell of a lot. I think that America could lead the world toward total nuclear disarmament like Superman 4 if they would only just do the work. If that's what they thought was in the national interest, was in humanity's interest. That we don't have these fission and fusion weapons anymore. They're just too big and too devastating. You just can't do it. And you get everybody to go along with that. You could do it. The American, and especially if we had our Russian friends and our European allies on board for that, we could just get rid of nukes in a year. The American people would have to demand it though. And the rest of the world, the ones that have nukes, they're not going to disarm unless, one, the threat of America nuking them is taken away. But also, as long as they, have all that pressure on them internationally, that this is what's happening. This is what all of humanity demands and led by the United States to do it. I think they would go along.
All right. Well,
Gorbachev almost had this deal back when the USSR still existed. We'll get rid of all of our nukes. And they were a hair away at Reykjavik. And then, it was called off. And unfortunately, the real sticking point was Reagan's promise to the American people that he would build a missile defense shield, and he wouldn't back down on that to Gorbachev, even though, of course, turns out that was, especially in 1986, was the most ridiculous of future pipe dreams. They were going to have a nuclear weapon shield in space, of any kind of workable thing for even no matter how many $1 trillion you have. And so over just a complete chimera there, the thing was quashed. And that was at a time where, both sides were sitting on like 30,000 nukes each, 40,000 nukes each or something at that point. So we've seen major disarmament since then. If we could go from a height of 70,000 nuclear weapons on the American side and 40 or 50 something on the Russian side in the worst of the Cold War, and we can go down to just 7,000 each where we are today, right, approximately around 7,000 each, with more in storage, but still look at what a vast reduction that is. That ought to go to show the possibility right there. And then after all, even the slightest bit, the slightest, fraction of our conventional military is more than enough to defend the continental United States, Alaska and Hawaii forever and ever. No one's going to mess with us. We still have Moab bombs. We can still bomb your capital city if you bomb us. And I mean all other things being equal here with the U.S. government, that they don't need nukes to defend us. We don't need to believe that they do.
All right, Scott. Well, this, opens up another 100 questions I want to ask you on geopolitics, but we're probably at over an hour now, so we should probably wrap up. But I'm going to probably submit one of those questions in your new Reddit group. And okay. Do you want to tell people how to get in there? And I guess you're not on Twitter anymore, right? So Reddit is where to find you?
Yeah, which, I was wanting to quit Twitter anyway. It's not that I'm pouting over their persecution of me over the last week. They did reactivate my account and they sent me an email saying, "Oh, that was all a misunderstanding. Sorry about that." Yeah. Thanks, guys. But no, I was wanting to quit anyway, just because I can't use Twitter responsibly. I'm a Twitter, tweaker, and I spend way, way, way too much time on it. And it's really like tobacco. I just have to give it up. And I really want to. And I even, I need to test it out, but I want it to be set where my Reddit posts don't even push to Twitter anymore. But so I'm not quitting Twitter just to push everybody over to the Reddit thing. I was going to do the Reddit thing anyway. At the same time, I was trying to quit Twitter and not really having much success at it. So, I'm kind of trying to take the, opportunity of getting my account suspended for a week to go ahead and continue to stay off of there. And guess what? I'm actually reading We Meant Well by Peter Van Buren, which is great, which I should have read a long time ago. It's all about, the latter days of Iraq War II, at a forward operating base in South Baghdad. And, yeah, it's really funny, man. It's horrible, but it's good. So, and then I'm almost finished too with Daniel Ellsberg's book on nuclear weapons, The Doomsday Machine, which everybody really ought to read. And I've been putting that off, and I blame myself for using Twitter more than any other thing, keeping me from getting these books knocked out. So, and I have such a pile here. I got both of Ramsey Baroud's books. I got Stephen Walt's new book he sent me, and he endorsed my book. So that's pretty good. I should probably, read and review and have him on the show to talk about his new book, and, a ton of stuff, man, that I really need to catch up on. And so, and Steve Call's book about Pakistan and the ISI support for the Afghan Taliban and all this. That's my plan, is to really get over Twitter, but you can find me on Reddit. It's a private Reddit group, like Tom Wood's group for Facebook, only I hate Facebook. So I'm doing it on Reddit, and it's, reddit.com/r/Scott Horton Show. And then, so anybody who's donating $5 or more to the show per month, and you can do that at patreon.com/Scott Horton Show, or at Scott Horton Show/donate, and, do $5 a month there. And, I'll give you the keys to the Reddit group. It's already shaping up pretty good. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in there. I like it too. I know Mance is in that group. And actually, when you had announced it, I hopped on with Tom Woods and said, Scott, you should really do it on Facebook. But I actually like the Reddit group more, especially for like the foreign policy stuff, because you could really like go through and find all the posts and everything. It's a lot more organized and just easier to find the older posts and the older threads and stuff like that. So definitely, if you like this, foreign policy kind of stuff, and you like listening to my show and Scott's show, it's a great resource in the group. Again, Scott, thank you so much. You can find Scott's work. He's the editor of antiwar.com. The book is Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Great book. And of course, I guess the best place to go to find my and Scott's work is libertarianinstitute.org. My show's on there. Scott's show's on there. I do a daily news roundup that's on the homepage of the show as well. So, thanks so much, everybody, for listening. And thanks, Scott, for coming on.